Hello, biology students. Today we're going to talk about how evolution and genetics are related. This is something we've mentioned a little bit already over the past few days, but we're going to talk more specifically today about how evolution is really rooted in genetics and changes within the DNA. We've talked before about how the process of natural selection requires three things. Within a population of organisms, there has to be variation, so there has to be differences within individuals. There has to be some type of competition, some type of struggle for existence. And the differences, that variation needs to affect the individual's fitness. So the variations have to matter to their survival and ability to reproduce. The place that genetics comes in is at the very beginning. Variation, the reason that every individual organism is a little different, is because every individual has differences in their DNA. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about where that variation comes from. You know that every individual is a little bit different, and that variation provides the raw material for evolution. Those differences have to already be there in order for natural selection to be able to work. Those differences are completely random. We don't have any control over what genes we get. The differences also have to be found in your DNA. Any other differences between people, things like if you get a tattoo or if you dye your hair, those are not genetic differences. And so they're not differences that can be acted on by natural selection. Genetic differences come from mutations, from those random mistakes that are made as DNA is being copied and passed on. They also come from the process of sexual reproduction and that meiotic cell division, meiosis, that we talked about in the previous unit, where half of mom's chromosomes get put into an egg cell and half of dad's chromosomes get put into a sperm cell. That process of meiosis has a lot of randomness to it because exactly what half of your mom's DNA or what half of dad's DNA get put into those cells is random. And there's also the random mixing of which egg cell and which sperm cell come together to create that new genetic combination. So all of those things, that mixing up of DNA during the process of sexual reproduction and the process of mutation, generate random differences in individuals' DNA. So that's where variation comes from. And then once there's variation within that population, as we've been talking about, if that variation makes a difference to the organism's ability to survive and reproduce, then it is passed on if it's a beneficial difference, and that's the process of natural selection. But the variation has to be there first, and that happens randomly within the DNA. We can also see the importance of genetics in several of the types of evidence that we talked about yesterday. So these are the 8 types of evidence that we took notes on yesterday. See if you can identify which ones of these are based in genetics. You might have talked about some others. The first few, we could kind of argue that there's genetics involved in that, and there's definitely genetics involved in artificial selection. But these 4 common genes, embryology, vestigial structures, and homologous structures are all directly related to inheriting DNA and similar genes from a common ancestor. That's why embryos look so similar early in development, because they've inherited the same genes. Vestigial structures are kind of genetic leftovers. They're genes that are still there, even if the function of that structure isn't there anymore. Homologous structures are coded for by the same genes that have been passed down from common ancestors. So we talked actually about a lot of genetic evidence yesterday as well. So we're going to go back. This may seem like something we should have started with at the beginning of the unit, but we're actually going to take a minute now and think about how we define what evolution actually is. Now that we've talked about kind of how we first figured this out, the observations that led to this theory and how the process works and the evidence for it, If you had asked Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace to define evolution, they probably would have said something like this. It's the process by which modern organisms, meaning the ones that live on the planet today, have descended over long periods of time from common ancestors. So that explains evolution as kind of the tree of life idea. All living things are related to each other somewhere in the distant past of Earth through common ancestors. As we've learned more about how exactly evolution happens and how the new variations show up and how they get passed on, we can define it a little differently. Both of these definitions are true and correct, but this one focuses a little bit more on the genetic aspect. What evolution actually is at the genetic level is a change in the gene pool of a population over many generations. Here's a couple important things to note about that definition. First, this term gene pool might be new to you. A gene pool is all of the alleles for a particular trait within an entire population. So if you think about a trait like eye color, I have 2 copies of the gene for eye color. I have 2 alleles, one that I got from my mom and one that I got from my dad. And I happen to have 2 alleles for blue eyes, and so I have blue eyes. But within the entire human population, there are alleles for blue eyes and brown eyes and probably several others that help combine to make all the different shades of eye color that we have. So all of the alleles for eye color within the entire human population make up the gene pool for that trait. A population in biology refers to a group of organisms of the same species that all live within relatively the same area. So they interact with each other throughout their life. They compete for resources like food and shelter. They mate and have offspring with other members of that population. And so when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about change in the overall genetic makeup, the gene pool of a group of organisms. One individual organism can't change its DNA within its lifetime, but over time, and that also is in this definition, this process takes time. Over several generations, or at least a few generations, the genetic makeup of an entire group of organisms can change. That's the process of evolution. Today in class, we are going to illustrate that process by doing an activity called Toothpick Fish, where we're going to be using toothpicks to represent the gene pool of a population of fish. If you're not able to be at class today, I'm going to explain this to you a little bit so you can kind of understand how this works. And then you are going to be using some data that was collected during class to complete the assignment for today. The document that you're working on for this looks like this. And so the background information, the introduction just kind of explains the background and talks a little bit about the process of natural selection. And you can see here in the materials, students who did this activity in class started with a baggie full of toothpicks where 8 were red, 8 were green, and 8 were yellow. That represents the gene pool of a population of fish. There are alleles for red, green, and yellow that exist within this population of fish. Then you get a little bit of information about the genetics of this trait. The green gene is dominant over all the other colors. Red is recessive to green, yellow is recessive to green. So basically, if they get at least 1 green allele, they will be a green fish. If they have 2 R alleles, they'll be red. 2 yellow alleles would be Y. And if you combine red and yellow, those are incompletely dominant, and that results in an orange phenotype. So there are a few questions you are going to answer about the genetics of this trait. And then you're going to read through these instructions. What students did in class is they threw all the toothpicks together in a baggie, and then randomly, without looking, they pulled them out 2 at a time. And that represents how the genes within a population are randomly mixed up. And the genes, the alleles that one individual gets are random. And so, depending on what alleles that organism gets, here is an example of what this might look like. So, this picture on the right shows a person randomly pulling out 2 toothpicks at a time to represent the 2 alleles. So, these top 2 toothpicks are the 2 alleles that this baby fish got, one from mom and one from dad. And one of the things you'll be asked to do as part of this lab is to list the genotype and phenotype of each fish in each generation. So this first one got 2 G alleles. So its genotype would be GG, and its phenotype, that would be a green fish. Then next, this person pulled out 2 red toothpicks. That fish would be RR, that would be a red fish. Then you can see we got a green and a red. Remember that introduction told you green is dominant, so this is also going to be a green fish. And then we got a GY, a green and a yellow. That will also be a green fish. So that's kind of an example of how you are going to be recording your data. Because you were not able to do this activity in class, we have gathered some data for you. So as you read through the activity handout, you are going to be using this set of data to fill in your data table, but read through the activity as you go because it will explain how the environment of these fish changed and affected the selection of these fish. Certain fish, because of the environment they were in, did not survive. And so you'll see that's why the population, like there aren't quite as many fish in the last 3 generations as there were at the beginning. And in the 5th generation, if you look way at the bottom of the screen here, the very last generation only had 2 red and 2 orange fish left. So copy this data into your lab activity document that's posted in Google Classroom today. You will need to fill in the phenotypes for all of the fish and figure out what they look like, and read through the document to understand what happened and answer the questions about what happened to this fish population over time. Please contact your teacher if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.